we have seen a number of mass shootings, and after the shooting at Uvalde, one group, actually from Tarleton University, which is part of the Texas A&M network, started looking at, well, what's going on there? The Institute for Predictive Analytics in Criminal Justice started looking at data to try and better understand the phenomena. And the person who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice and Strategic Studies there at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas, they were critical he played a critical role in that particular study. And it is Dr. Alex Del Carmen joining us on the Wake Up Call this morning. Doc, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, when you started putting this together, where were you kind of collecting this information from so that you could come up with, I don't know, a way to identify these particular individuals that may perpetrate these kind of crimes?
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity. So I will tell you that IPAC, which is our institute, we analyzed a National Institute of Justice, NIJ-funded database that was actually produced by a group of scholars from the Violence Project. And we basically looked at 178 mass shootings that occurred between 1966 and May of 2021. And we found some really, really interesting typologies that now, sadly, we're seeing more and more of it in the past few weeks.
Okay, so let's get into some of those. Of these, I mean, one of the things is they're, 98% guys, right?
Right. So most of the individuals that, engage in a mass shooting are males. A significant portion of them are 30 years of age or younger. They simply show that most of them, about two-thirds of them, have a mental illness history, and most of them also have a criminal history. So what we found is that there is a pattern, so to speak. It doesn't mean that, all the shooters are going to be less than 30, but what it does mean is that we see a cluster of these data components in most of these mass shootings that are taking place.
So when you say they've got a criminal background, are we talking about a violent criminal background or necessarily, or, other things like shoplifting? I mean, what kind of, do we have kind of an idea of the kind of crimes that they may be committing prior to, one of these shootings?
Yeah, so it's pretty much all over the place, right? Some of them have had a history of violence. Some of them have had a history of property-related crimes. But what we do see is that there's been sort of an increase of the engagement of illegal activities, whether it's violent crime or property crime, in their years leading up to the event, right? So there's almost like a degeneration of the morality of the individual that culminates, in the mass shooting.
You say they have a mental illness history. That's a real vague kind of statement, because mental illness can be, just the phrase is vague. When you say mental illness, does this mean that they have been treated, that they have gone to a psychologist? Does it mean that they're on, antidepressants? I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah, so the research and the data that's available is not that granular, but what we do see, however, is that 69% of them, of those that we studied, exhibited signs of what we call mental illness, which is basically anything related to depression, anxiety. Most of them have had some degree of exposure to psychiatric care, but that doesn't mean that they are actually receiving psychiatric care or under some sort of medication at the time of the crime.
Do we... my understanding is, and I've discussed this with some other people, and I was never sure whether, they were qualified as sources, but I've heard that it is very difficult for an individual or for the justice system to get and release information as to whether an individual who has been charged and convicted of a crime, whether they were actually on psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, that kind of thing. Is that true or not?
It's very true, and part of the issue is because we have these privacy laws that we do, that information is not readily available, and oftentimes the Justice Department and, most of the individuals looking at the enforcement of the law are not going to have access to that. So that's one of our biggest challenges, right? But what we do know, however, from this NIJ-related data is that these are based on questionnaires and questions that were asked not only of the offenders, those that actually survived the incident, but also their family members that were able to testify to the fact that their loved ones, had some sort of exposure to psychiatric care.
How helpful would it be to know whether they were taking those kind of drugs?
It would be helpful from the standpoint of being able to, identify whether or not they're receiving psychiatric care at the time of the event, and whether, there was some sort of failure in being able to be treated that resulted in the violent act, right? So from that standpoint, it would be helpful. But also, I would warn you that then we cross that very thin line between, what the government knows and what everybody else knows versus what the individual is experiencing. And as you know, our Constitution does protect us from that. So it's that balance between safety, between what the public requires in terms of safety versus the individual's rights.
Joining us on the Wake Up Call, Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. We're talking about this study that was put together looking specifically at these mass shooters. One of the things, and I'm kind of want to make a differentiation here. We hear about school shooters and then folks that go in and say, attack a workplace. Does your study make a division between and the differences between those two types of mass shootings?
We do, and what we did find is that, for instance, most of the mass shooters do not have a relationship to the location where the mass shooting takes place, right? But there are notable exceptions. For instance, those individuals that are, shooters of schools or related to schools or universities, or even workplace shootings, we do find that there is nearly most of the time they have some sort of a connection or an inside relationship to the location of the incident. So we found it to be fascinating, right? So the individual, if the actual shooting takes place in a school or a university or even a workplace, there is a connection, whereas if the mass shooting takes place, say, in a public location or something to that effect, typically there is not a connection between the person and the actual event.
Now, one of the things that the study says is that they had a recent employment change, about 55% of them. What are you able to take away from that?
Well, what we found is that there's been some sort of an alteration, right, into their routine. And so, prior to engaging in that mass shooting event, 55% of them had experienced some sort of a recent employment change, whether they lost their job or they transitioned to another job, but when you look at workplace shootings, the percentage rose significantly to 78%. So we can make a correlation or a relationship between those individuals that engage in workplace shootings and those individuals, say, that have been dismissed from their job, right? Doesn't mean that every person that's dismissed from their job is going to turn out to be an active shooter. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that, those individuals that did engage in workplace violence, have that in common, right? 78% of them had been fired or had been terminated for some sort of a reason, close to when the event took place.
And typically then I take it they go back to the place that they were terminated from or left to commit that particular crime.
Exactly. And so what they do is they go back and, they want to, quote unquote, get back to the employer, whether that's an individual at the workplace, say a supervisor, or just simply other employees that did not seem to care in the perception of the offender, right, about their dismissal.
Most of the shooters, though, at least according to that you looked at and were able to study, they had communicated their intentions in advance. Talk about that.
Yeah, so most of them have a form of expression, what we call social media, signature, digital signature. And so what that means is that most of them actually, announced or let somebody know that they had intentions. And I will warn you and say that in some cases, their intent was very general. And, for instance, I want to hurt somebody, right? Or, I think that, people should die, or I have plans to, get back at those that, harm me. They're very nonspecific, while in other cases they began to sort of provide more specificity and more clues leading up to the event. The problem with that is that law enforcement has a challenge of being able to identify, the millions of individuals that are posting comments similar to that on a daily basis on social media sources versus somebody that actually has the intention and is clearly having that mental breakdown that's leading up to the event.
Is there any hypothesis as to why that these people tip their hand in advance, that they want to do this? I mean, are they looking for attention? Are they looking to be stopped? Or what's going on there?
Yeah, I think, it depends on who you ask, right? Most of us criminologists would say that that's really an attempt to sort of leave a trophy or let people know that, they're about to do something spectacular, so they want the attention leading up to the person. They clearly don't do it because they want to be caught, although some people argue that, subliminally they're trying to tell other people, please, I need help, help me out. I see it more as a signature, more as a, almost like the preamble to the event. And so they want to create as much, attention as they can to bring to that event, and so that's why they announce it, and they just simply want others to talk about it and raise that quote-unquote question mark of the mystery of what it is that's going to be their next target.
Hence, we go back to the, the saw, if you see something, say something.
Right. Although, it's interesting because, one of the things we found is that some people that are around these individuals that are expressing their desire to kill on social media are absolutely clueless, right, that their loved one is doing that. And so what we have learned is that, there's really just a huge gap between, two people that may live under the same roof as far as what one of them is doing online versus what the other one is experiencing or learning about what the individual is doing online.
When you say they're clueless, I mean, is there also a possibility that they've seen these kind of messages and they just think, no, Bob wouldn't do that. There's no way that he would do that. How much of denial comes into it?
Yeah, some of it, and I imagine that some people are not telling us the truth, right? When we survey them, but if you look at the statistics, in that the majority of these individuals are 30 years old or less. There seems to be almost like an increase of presence of young people that are committing these crimes, and some of them, I would argue, most of them live with their parents or their loved ones, which again, we just give that key to the car, so to speak. We allow these individuals to have free access to the internet. They spend hours in front of the internet, and their parents are just simply at work, working multiple jobs sometimes and taking care of other things, and they just simply do not know what they don't know, right? And then all of a sudden they see their kid, either being killed or engaging in some sort of a violent act on television. And all of them are not only shocked that happened, but also disturbed about the fact that they never paid attention to those signs.
Do you look at whether there are, other than the social media, are there other warning signs? Let's say that you have, you're a parent, you have a kid. Are there other symptoms that maybe that they are presenting on a personal level that a parent that was being observant could go, this is not right?
Right. So, when you put the whole picture together, you look at the person that is, a loner, an individual that seems to be angry at everything and everyone, someone that's likely have been, clinically treated for some sort of a depression or anxiety disorder, someone that has had, violent fantasies that are being expressed through drawings, paintings, graphic media, or even social media. So the anger is there, right? The frustration is there. The expression of that frustration through the acts of violence is being depicted through art or other means. And so, but oftentimes, parents just ignore it and say, oh, yeah, that individual was doing that, or my son was doing that because he's an artist, or because she's somebody that wants to express herself online. And they ignore what that really means. In other words, that the fantasy is going to result in a reality of some sort. Now, we'll caution your audience to say, just because your kid is, drawing, things related to murder or watching, mystery movies or horror movies, it doesn't mean that your kid's going to turn out to be a violent person. But what we do know, however, is that people that have had this sort of disturbed, pattern, the end result is, in fact, violence.
Dr. Alex de Carmen joining us on the wake-up call this morning. Off of our email, 1120kpnw@gmail.com, the Chris Dental inbox, this is actually a pretty good question. They ask, how many shooters come from fatherless homes?
It's a mixed bag. Being that our divorce rate is over 50% in our country, what we've found is that, a lot of them do come from broken homes per se, but that doesn't mean that if you come from a broken home or a fatherless home, that means that you're going to turn out to be a violent, criminal. So it's again, I caution the audience to make sure that we don't read more into this than what it is. But obviously, as far as we know, and the data was not very specific, there is a significant number of them that have the absence of a parent at home, whether that means that the parent is, in prison or has abandoned the home or is simply not around guarding and taking care of the individual because they're committed to work and other endeavors.
Well, that brings up another question then. I mean, was there a look at the statistics of how many of these people that commit these mass shootings did have a parent that was incarcerated? And I say that because it kind of goes to an issue, I guess, sort of parenting, but is that a prevalent thing in these shooters?
We didn't have access to that information, but what we do know, however, is that some of it is sort of a familial connection to violence, and they've either experienced domestic violence acts or they've seen violence in their lives. But it's really hard to be able to get that data because, as you can imagine, parents are not willing to share it, and sometimes these suspects end up dying. So there's no one to interview ex post facto. Okay,
so you brought up dying. Shoot, we're almost out of time. We'll have to get to this quickly. Most of the shooters die at the scene, generally by suicide, correct?
That's correct. So what we found is that, the great majority of them end up, committing suicide among those that actually die, right? So 60% of them die at the scene, and if you look further into that data, 65% of those that died at the scene died by a self-inflicted wound or self-inflicted act.
Why? Why did they commit suicide? If they're looking for the attention, why are they shooting themselves?
I imagine because they understand the ramifications of what they have done to some degree, right? So some of them are like, well, I'm not going to be taken alive because I'm going to go to prison and perhaps be executed. In some other case, which would be a rational, sort of decision to make. The other one would be, I also don't like me for what I just did, even though I want to live in the legacy, in the books, in the history books as being one of the mass shooters, but I'm going to go out because I have the courage to kill myself. I mean, you got to remember, we criminologists spend most of the time thinking about what the bad guy is thinking so that we can better understand and hopefully prevent those acts. And I will tell you that this is no exception to that. So, it's an irrational thought that clearly is what part of their fantasy is, that they're going to be taken out by their own gun, almost as a victim or as a crusader in that particular act.
I wish we had more time. Dr. Del Carmen, I appreciate you joining us on the Wake Up Call this morning. Fascinating study. Love to have you back in the future.
Thanks for having me.
All right, you take care.